from Amos and Micah to Francis and Clare, and through modern-day prophets like St. Oscar Romero, Dorothy Day, Sister Diana Ortiz, and Bishop Tom Gumbleton. We can trust that when we need a word of power, a word of warning, a word of consolation, or a word of hope, God will send those to whom we would be wise to listen. Our speaker tonight is one of those prophets, one of those voices like John the Baptist, calling out in the wilderness and inviting us as individuals, as a nation, as a church, back into right relationship with our God. At Christi USA's 50th Anniversary National Conference in August, Bishop Stowe challenged our church, lamenting how Catholics who promote the death penalty are awarded for doing so, how eager we are for vengeance and retaliation, willing to bless armaments but not some couples, how the institution cannot bring itself to say Black Lives Matter, and how self-proclaimed uber-Catholics insist that they know more or better than the Pope. On our topic tonight, Bishop Stowe has written that we must strive to be vigilant about the violence that can be found in each of our hearts, the wolf that lies within. The ease with which we can dismiss our opponents or even dehumanize them, the words that come forth that are themselves violence, to say nothing of tweets. It is too easy to respond in kind to ugliness and violence, but that cannot be our way. Out of the treasury of our hearts, our mouths speak. Let us build that treasury up with our prayer and study and action, calling each other to greater integrity as people of peace whose light shines forth through a prism of peace, providing beauty in the midst of so much gloomy despair. Bishop John Stowe is a conventional Franciscan friar and has served as the third bishop of Lexington, Kentucky since 2015. Prior to that appointment by Pope Francis, he was the vicar provincial and the rector of the Basilica and National Shrine of Our Lady of Consolation in Cary, Ohio. He had previously served in the Diocese of El Paso for 15 years as a pastor, and for 8 of those years as the Vicar General and moderator of the Curia. A native of Lorain, Ohio, Bishop John has bachelor's degrees, as we just heard, in philosophy and in history from St. Louis University, and a master's of divinity and licentiate in sacred theology from the Jesuit School of Theology at Berkeley, California. So we've got the Jesuit thing going and the Franciscan thing going. Throughout his ministry, he has been actively engaged in the promotion of peace and justice, involved in community organizing and ecumenical and interfaith dialogue. He serves as the bishop president of my own organization, Pax Christi USA, and he is on the administrative committee of the Bishops' Conference and on the subcommittee for the Catholic Campaign for Human Development. And he is the Episcopal moderator for the Catholic Committee of Appalachia. Bishop John often speaks of his admiration of Pope Francis. He has shared how blessed we are at this moment to have a pontiff who invites us to be bold, to take chances, to heed the cries of the earth and the cries of the poor. A pope who expresses his preference for a church that is hurting and bruised because it is out in the streets rather than suffocating from being confined. As someone who has gotten to see Bishop John's own witness and ministry close up and personal, I think he shares in those very characteristics that he praises Pope Francis for. We are so blessed and lucky to have with us tonight this prophet, this pastor, this true disciple striving to live out Jesus' proclamation of the reign of God here and now. Please join me in welcoming Bishop John Stowe.
Thank you very much, Johnny. The only two titles I will accept on that list are disciple and pastor. Hopefully it'll work on the other ones. And thank you, Father David, for the great welcome. And with all due respect to St. Oscar Romero, I think we do have some master builders among us tonight. You know, when I look around this room, you have the who's who of the social justice community in Catholic St. Louis, and some new folks that hopefully will learn more about what it is to build this kingdom here in St. Louis. So it's really an honor to be in your presence, in your midst. When Father Jack Schuler invited me to do this talk for the St. Cronin community, and I think it kind of grew from there, so thanks to all of the sponsors who made this happen, he suggested a theme about how the church can be prophetic in a time of great polarization. And my first reaction was, what do they know about polarization at St. Cronin? They don't think alike over there, right? But polarization has certainly become a buzzword, and it's certainly a part of our reading of the signs of the times now. And as Christians, we can't be comfortable with that polarization, and we have to find ways to surpass it. Pope Francis has shown us on multiple occasions that we shouldn't be fearful of differences, even when we clash, because that opens a way for us to recognize where God can do what we can't. And so if we humbly accept those differences and that polarization and allow God to lead us in a new direction, that's how new things are born, new ideas come to life. Thinking about the idea that Martin Luther King Jr. was in the same building 58 years ago this week is really impressive. It's really humbling to be in this place and think about how that giant among us spoke right to these, right within these walls, and to people very much like ourselves. You know, he was a polarizing figure at this time. And many of us have been accused of being polarizing because sometimes when you stand for something, the opposition is going to consider you the problem. But if we do so in a Christian way and in a hopeful way, we find the ways to find our common humanity and find something greater that we can all aim for. So I hope to point us in that direction tonight. I find that I must frequently go back to the admonition in St. Peter's letter about being able to defend our hopefulness at all times. 1 Peter 3, verse 15, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. As Christians, we believe in the resurrection of the innocent victim Jesus from the dead. We must always then be a people of hope. That hope is perhaps the most important thing we can offer in this or any time. But to be always hopeful is a challenge for believers on par with St. Paul's admonitions to pray always and give thanks in all circumstances. But really, our hopefulness can only be nourished by such prayer and such gratitude. Now, for hope to be virtuous, it can't be naive, and it can't be detached from the real world circumstances in which we live and move. For hope to be virtuous, it has to be more than the pie in the sky spirituality that Marx rightly called the hoping of the people. Christian hope can only be anchored in our encounter with the risen one who shows us the marks of his suffering and death, who has tasted the bitter cup of abandonment, the crucified one who came back from the dead, not for vengeance, but to proclaim the triumph of mercy and forgiveness. Always be prepared to give an answer to anyone who asks you to give a reason for the hope that you have. It was a challenge for me to convey hopefulness not so long ago when I stood in a house in Jackson, Kentucky, where the waters of the Kentucky River had been flowing through hours before and risen high enough to fill the glasses on the top shelf of the cupboard with water. How to share hope with the woman whose family has lived in this home for more than a century, and when it seems damaged beyond repair, and when the paltry sum offered by FEMA wouldn't be near enough to repair the flooring, much less to purchase a place on higher ground where the river may or may not reach in the next flood. But fortunately, FEMA is not the source of our hope. And there was indeed a glimmer of hope when volunteers from the Chancery came to muck out that house, and volunteer students appeared on the corner handing out pizza and soft drinks, and as plenty of money and supplies poured in from all over the country. It's always been a challenge to speak a word of hope when sitting with someone who's received a terminal diagnosis, with a young person who's been excluded from her family or school because of her experience of gender dysphoria, or with women of all ages who keep asking when their church will acknowledge their gifts. It's challenging to have a reason for hope when a young white kid holding a Black Lives Matter sign on a street in Arkansas just last week was subjected to cursing, insults, death threats, and violence by white people driving by and wondering out loud why their lives don't matter. How do we give a reason for hope to talented and bright dreamers who see court after course discuss and then pass the buck back and forth concerning their future in the only country they've ever known, and who worry about the constant risk of deportation to a land they don't know? How do we defend our hope to the person whose skin color has determined that they will likely be incarcerated for the same crime that others get away with routinely? And how do we preach hope to Ukrainian villages whose dead ones, whose loved ones are buried in their gardens, and whose retaking of their own land is met with threats of nuclear annihilation? How can I keep asking about hope describing such dreary and depressing realities? And I could easily go on for an hour or more with these. In his most recent encyclical, now 2 years old, Fratelli, Tutti, or Brothers and Sisters All, Pope Francis' first chapter is called Dark Clouds on the Horizon. Our ever-smiling Pope can also be pretty straightforward. He bluntly described the state of the planet Earth as a giant pile of filth in his previous encyclical, Laudato Si. Clearly, he doesn't conflate hope with overlooking or denying the painful realities and drastic circumstances of the present. Neither did Martin Luther King, a prophet of hope. Nor did Jesus, who, when carrying the cross in the streets of Jerusalem, made time to comfort the women and children who felt sorry for them. Perhaps the most iconic photo of Pope Francis, more so than those with his ubiquitous smile, will be the one where he's standing alone in a dreary, rainy, and dark St. Peter's Square, but for the Eucharistic presence during the very worst days of the pandemic. At that time, the Pope managed to convey a message of hope, even as he described the present reality of isolation, loneliness, and despair, and reminded us of the disciples in the boat, fearful, while Jesus was sound asleep in the cushion. The prophetic voice is the voice of hope that knows a better tomorrow is on the horizon. The voice of a leader who knows that our tradition has the resources to transform the world. Think of the voices of the enslaved people singing songs of freedom in the promised land, even as they picked cotton in the dreadful heat. Pope Francis finds a reason for his hope in the example of the cartoneros in his native Argentina, folks retrieving cardboard from landfills, garbage heaps, to sell to recyclers in order to provide food for their families. Hope is seen not only in their admirable struggle, but especially when he witnessed them organize in solidarity with each other to work for better conditions and create those conditions for themselves, to demand higher prices for their cardboard, and to gain the respect of those who would ridicule or exclude them because of their poverty. Hope is found in the witness of Haitians singing psalms of praise, thanking God that they're alive after yet another natural disaster has destroyed their homes and land. Hope is found because some people are still willing to risk their personal freedom and comfort to remind the rest of us that nuclear warfare is still being manufactured when we've overlooked that reality, being distracted by so many other threats. Pope Francis finds hope in the willingness of the Samaritan to interrupt his plans for the day when he encounters a Jewish man on the roadside, beaten up by robbers and left in pain. The Samaritan's probably already experienced the inhumanity and the cruelty of the world. He's a foreigner in a land where he's despised and considered to have no rights there. But he feels compassion for the victim, even as a priest and Levite from his own people have walked by without getting their hands dirty. The Samaritan managed to get the victim onto his own donkey, despite the fact that this victim in any other circumstance would probably have discriminated against him, the Samaritan. The Samaritan takes the victim to an inn, tenderly cares for him, and pays the innkeeper to take care of him further. In this story, Jesus' rabbinic answer to the question, "Who is my neighbor?" lies our hope as a human family. We can overcome boundaries that we have created and respond to humanity in need. The Pope laments that in the global pandemic, the human family did not come together as neighbors, much less as family, to collaborate on a response to save lives, but divided itself along ideological lines and missed an opportunity to respond to a global crisis as a global community. How will we ever face the dangers of the climate crisis in ways that will preserve the human race if we can't do so as sisters and brothers? The governor of my own state of Kentucky went on television every day throughout the pandemic and reminded the residents of the Commonwealth, we are all in this together. It was the right message, to be sure, and he was completely sincere in presenting it. But it rather quickly became clear that some were more in this than others. While some could work their jobs remotely and be protected from the virus, others were deemed, quote, essential workers, but not compensated according to their essentialness. In many cases, the very same people evading deportation were not called essential when it suited the purposes of commerce and government, but not quite essential enough to have a path to residency or citizenship. It would be comical if the consequences weren't so real for these people and their families. It's not unlike the political stunt that had a governor of Florida luring undocumented Venezuelans from Texas and sending them to Martha's Vineyard under false pretenses. Post-Ian, post-hurricane, Florida can't get enough undocumented people to haul debris and rebuild everything that lies in the path of destruction throughout the state. I don't know many people who see Pope Francis's proposal that we finally recognize our common humanity as more important than what divides us, and that we truly live as members of one family, as anything but a nice thought or an unrealistic dream. Part of the nice things that a holy person should say. But Francis is serious, and he fully admits that he's not afraid of dreaming. He explains that according to the scriptures and tradition, the constant touchstone for our beliefs and teachings, he discerns that this is also God's dream. To be prophetic in times of polarization requires discerning what God is calling us to at this moment, and working to overcome the divisions that we create. It also requires reconciliation, which can't happen without forgiveness. The Pope is not afraid to say that this spirit, indeed the spirit of love and charity, has to influence our politics for the common good. What a concept! He describes political love as a saving force for humanity. How many days until the midterms? When Pope Francis signed the encyclical Fratelli, Tutti at the tomb of St. Francis on the vigil of his feast in 2020, it was in the midst of a simple Mass celebrated with social distancing and only a single concelebrant, certainly not the norm for papal Masses. And he tells us that originally he intended to write an encyclical about the role of the world's religions today. But the pandemic seemed to require that he broaden the topic. In this encyclical, Pope Francis simply preaches the gospel while reading the signs of the times. Like the gospel itself, the encyclical is a call to conversion which recognizes that the human family cannot continue on the dangerous path on which we find ourselves. Quote, "A real and lasting peace will only be possible on the basis of a global ethic of solidarity and cooperation in the service of a future shaped by interdependence and shared responsibility of the human family." The call that he makes so clear is to be converted from the globalization of indifference, a term that Pope Francis first used on the island of Lampedusa, where he celebrated Mass on an altar fashioned from a wrecked ship on which migrants fleeing Africa perished. In recent days, Pope Francis has called the Mediterranean Sea the world's largest cemetery, as the world continues to resist welcoming those who are striving to save their lives. He also gives us a call to conversion from what he calls the technocratic paradigm. The technocratic paradigm, a phrase employed in the early encyclical Laudato Si, and referring to our dependence on technical solutions to human problems, even spiritual problems, and allowing the market economy to dominate and take priority over human flourishing. Let us dream then as a single human family, the Pope says, as fellow travelers sharing in the same flesh, as children of the same earth, which is our common home, each of us bringing the richness of his or her beliefs and convictions, each of us with his or her own voice, brothers and sisters all. You have to remember that when this encyclical was presented to the world, the United States was in turmoil not only because of the pandemic, but by a presidential election like no other. Francis was by no means focused on the United States, but he was certainly not unaware of the depravity of the political rhetoric of that election. The fifth chapter of the encyclical is titled "A New Kind of Politics," in which the Pope makes it a point to contrast current forms and expressions of populism with what it truly means to be popular or of the people. Rather than something genuinely arising from the hopes and aspirations of the population, what populism should be, our contemporary label of populism is applied to a new form of polarization that pits one group of people against another. What connection does this populism have with the people, the Pope asks? He argues that this kind of populism exploits culture politically, while it appeals to the basest and most selfish inclinations of people. For example, Christian nationalism, aka white supremacy. For Francis, the people are of most importance. He even describes the people as a mythic category. To be part of a people is to be part of a shared identity arising from social and cultural bonds. In his words and thoughts, one can trace the influences of an Argentinian strand of contextual liberation theology in the articulation of this theme. Influences that the first Latin American Pope, has brought to the center of the church the chair of Peter. And because of his genuine concern for popular issues, the issues of the people, Francis has launched what he calls the World Gathering of Popular Movements. These gatherings have brought together community organizers and the popular agents who he calls the artisans of humanity and social poets, like his Cartonero friends from Argentina. They organize the impoverished and allow them to be agents, or in the term preferred by Pope Francis, protagonists of their own development. Tomorrow, in fact, October 14th, some organizers with the Industrial Areas Foundation with whom I worked in El Paso will be meeting with Pope Francis in Casa Santa Marta. The Catholic Campaign for Human Development, strongly and unfairly criticized too frequently by influential Catholics who are not on board with Pope Francis, is a major supporter of the organization of these popular movements in the United States. During these world gatherings, including one which took place in Modesto, California, the Pope has proposed that the whole world unite to work on the attainability of what in Spanish can be called the 3 T's: tierra, techo, y trabajo, land, housing, and work. These are fundamental needs and rights that too many people on the planet lack, and Pope Francis wants to listen to and work with all those who are promoting these goals, attaining. In the introduction to his chapter on politics, the Pope asks whether we understand politics as something noble or something dirty. Our answer to this question is quite informative about the state of affairs in our own experience. If our reaction to even the word politics is one of distaste or disgust, as if one needs to take a shower after saying it, it might be understandable given the current state of affairs. But as I frequently remind those who argue that politics has no place in church, they're confusing political with partisan. There's very little that isn't political. Should the church just be absent from the discussion? Voiceless in terms of making decisions about the flourishing or the suffering of people? Does our faith really not have any bearing on our political involvement? In a pluralistic society, if you don't resolve things politically, how should they be resolved? By force? Until very recently, the choice between a political solution and armed conflict seemed to be obvious in our country. Since January 6, 2021, I'm not so sure. Father Brian Massingale, a priest in Milwaukee, theology professor at Fordham, teacher of peace at Pax Christi, observed after the January 6th events at the Capitol that some people would be more comfortable with a white dictator than with a multicultural democracy. Sorry to say, I'm afraid he's correct. Continued talk these days of civil war seems to reinforce this. Politics in a democracy should involve the give and take of negotiated agreements favored by the majority, with the minority retaining their rights and respect. The winner-takes-all approach that has become the standard only breeds resentment and sets up an eventual backlash. And of course, we even have the question of what is political. Some of the same people who protest that racism, migration, and even to talk about the unionization of workers, which was the foundational point of modern Catholic social teaching, those things are too political for church, but they want abortion to be talked about even more. Pope Francis reminds us that politics is meant to be at the service of the common good. And when politics is understood as in the service of the common good, it's a noble vocation. Social, political, and economic participation are necessary for integral human development. If you paid any attention to Francis's reforms of the Roman Curia, probably not on the top of everybody's list, but he now has a dicastery or a department
on integral human development. The Pope introduces the concept of political charity, which is basically love of neighbor on a social or institutional level. Collective organization to promote human fraternity and social justice is political charity. And charity is the synthesis of the divine law. More than mere sentiment, charity is capable of building a new world. Working towards the recognition of universal fraternity is an exercise in charity. Organizing society to reduce or eliminate poverty is charity. The Pope offers that, as we all know, helping an elderly person to cross a river is an act of love, of charity. Organizing the resources to build a bridge for many people to cross the river is political charity, organized for the common good. Of course, our Latin American Pope advocates a preferential love for those in greatest need, but he explains that such preferential love requires truly seeing the poor and honoring their dignity by facilitating their agency, not reducing them to passivity and deciding what they need. The virtue of subsidiarity, involving people in their own development, is critical here. Involving a wide variety of voices is the way to ensure the common good, even when it complicates things. Disagreements may well give rise to conflicts, but uniformity, the Pope says, proves stifling and leads to cultural decay. In Fratelli, Tutti, and elsewhere, Pope Francis insists that economic rules, which are very effective for growth, are not necessarily so effective for integral human development. This is not a new thing introduced by Pope Francis. This has been a concern of the Church since Gaudium et Spes was promoted at Vatican II. What we see, says the Holy Father, is greater inequality. The poor, disabled, unborn, and elderly are treated as though they are disposable, and a Third World War is being fought piecemeal. Third World War being fought piecemeal can be seen in places as distinct as Ukraine and Uvalde, Texas. We think we can ensure stability and peace through a false sense of security, sustained by a mentality of fear and mistrust, he says. So we build walls. We continue on the path of globalization, but without a shared roadmap, and fail to sense that we're all in the same boat. We're all in this together. Those who raise walls, Pope Francis says, will end up as slaves behind the very walls they have built. They are left without horizons, for they lack interchange with others. For the healing of the world, for the healing of polarization, the conviction that all people are brothers and sisters needs to be embodied in real ways. The third and fourth chapter of the encyclical express a vision which is hopeful and a stark contrast to the dark clouds of the horizon. Here the Pope speaks of how to form hearts that are open to the whole world and embrace a vision of global fraternity. He emphasizes our approach to the neighbor in our midst and expands it from there. How wonderful it would be, the Pope muses, even as we discover faraway planets, to rediscover the needs of our brothers and sisters who orbit around us. Our approach to our neighbor, in the sense of the lesson of the Good Samaritan, has to include immigrants and refugees in our midst. How should we treat these immigrants? By welcoming, protecting, promoting, and integrating them. They are part of our journey forward. Indeed, they are part of us. Pope Francis suggests that we discontinue the pejorative terminology of minorities and recognize that all people have something to contribute. To recognize the reciprocal gifts of immigration, we need to discover the concept of gratuitousness. It means not everything has to be utilitarian, and not every relationship has to be economically advantageous. Things we need to distinguish between being partners in business, and being brothers and sisters. Some things we must do because they're good, not because of the reward they bring. Remember, Jesus taught us, God allows the sun and the rain to shine and fall on the good and the bad. Exiles, the Pope reminds us, can be found even in their own country. Every brother or sister in need, when ignored by the society in which I live, becomes an existential foreigner, even though born in the same country. They may be citizens with full rights, yet they are treated as foreigners in their own country. Here we might think of Ferguson, Michael Brown, what that conjures up in our memories. Racism, the Pope reminds us, is a virus that quickly mutates and instead of disappearing, goes into hiding and lurks in wait. The Pope also refers to the disabled as existential foreigners in their own homeland and insists that even if market freedom and efficiency don't know what to do with the disabled or the person in dire poverty, this doesn't justify their living with less dignity. Pursuing the common good includes pursuing the moral good, willing the good for others. The moral virtue of solidarity requires thinking and acting in terms of community. It applies to our use of resources and to our care of our common home. Pope Francis quotes his predecessor, Benedict XVI, stating, "We need to attain a global juridical, political, and economic order which can increase and give direction to international cooperation for the development of all peoples in solidarity." We're still stuck in the world of nation states. Commerce isn't limited by nation states. People are. Let us admit, says Francis, for all the progress we have made, we are basically illiterate when it comes to accompanying, caring for, and supporting the most frail and vulnerable members of our developed societies. Chapters 6 and 7 give directions for the art of dialogue, cultivating friendship, and paths of renewed encounter. And these chapters are already being enacted in the synodal process underway in the whole church. The Pope talks about the need for healing relationships and overcoming differences without pretending they're not there. Given the frequent mention of polarization of church and society that dominates any contemporary reading of the signs of our times, these chapters, 6 and 7, and the practice of the Synod should be of particular interest in the U.S. Church. Despite my disappointment at the lack of enthusiasm with which the Synod has been met in much of the United States, the published synthesis of the results of listening sessions across our country reveals far more common ground than any of us anticipated. I was happy to be the bishop responsible for bringing together a team to synthesize the reports from listening sessions in our region, the provinces of Louisville, Mobile, and New Orleans, a total of 18 dioceses. It was evident that a series of concerns that were heard loudly and clearly in my own diocese were also strongly present in the others. A desire to keep the young engaged in the life of the church, residual pain over the abuse scandals, concern about the treatment and role of women, clericalism, a desire for greater inclusivity, particularly among the LGBTQ community. Those things were heard over and over again. And when appointed to the committee that drafted the synthesis for the whole country, the same themes emerged all over. Next comes the continental stage, which for us means the U.S. and Canada, because Mexico and Central America will be joined to South America for linguistic and cultural reasons. From what I'm already reading from syntheses all over the world, the same themes are surfacing. While the Synod was technically restored for the Western Church in the Second Vatican Council, Pope Francis has energized and reformed it in a significant way. The Eastern churches have always maintained this process of walking together because they lack a top-down structure that emerged in the West, especially after the collapse of Rome. It was the ecumenical patriarch Bartholomew, the first ecumenical patriarch to participate in the installation of a pope, who years before Francis was elected, insisted there could be no healing the schism between East and West until the West was willing to temper its Petrine doctrine, that is the role of the papacy, with synodality, consultation, and joint discernment to plan the way forward. All previous synods have had only bishops as full participants and were heavily directed by the Roman Curia and the Pope. Now the Pope is engaged in worldwide consultation of the whole Church. The first phase involved listening, because a teaching church also has to be a listening church. Listening is the first step in dialogue. Dialogue involves and requires the ability to respect and find legitimacy in the other's point of view. The differences that emerge offer possibilities for creative solutions and are essential to dialogue. The feverish exchange of opinions on social networks is not the same as dialogue, nor can it be a substitute for dialogue. Pope Francis regularly insists that a culture of true encounter is needed, which involves integrating differences for the formation of social peace. The simple formulation that Francis offers, which would do us well to invoke in various current debates, is that people have a right to be themselves. They have a right to be different. When's the last time we heard that in church? The consensus that dialogue seeks is not relativism. Relativism allows another to impose the truth. The dialogic realism the Pope proposes that each remain faithful to their own principles, respecting that others have the right to do so as well. And kindness, he says, is the fruit of the Holy Spirit that frees us from cruelty and anxiety, while it facilitates the quest for consensus and opens new paths. Prophets are not so much those who are able to divine the future. They're those who read the signs of the present clearly and can see where we're headed if we don't heed the gospel call to conversion. Pope Francis certainly qualifies as prophetic by that definition. The fact that he meets so much resistance, especially in this country, places him in the company of true prophets, those of the Hebrew Scriptures, John the Baptist. It also places him in the company of more recent prophets, like Martin Luther King Jr., like St. Oscar Romero, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Sister Thea Bowman, and others who shared in this vision of a more peaceful and fraternal world, not afraid of differences nor seeking uniformity, but open to the Holy Spirit's direction to move forward. Francis is not content to stand alone. He frequently says he needs people around him. He needs people to share in this vision of the human family as truly a family. As the body of Christ, we are called to be prophetic and to help create this new world of interrelationships and encounters where Christ is ever present. Polarization is indeed present, a present sign of the times. It's not on the wane, especially as we approach the fabled midterm elections that have been touted since before the last presidential election ballots were counted. But the signs of our unity are not all buried as the synod is unfolding. Gaudium Mater Ecclesia, said John the 23rd, 60 years and 2 days ago, as he opened the Second Vatican Council. Rejoice, Mother Church. And in that same joyful opening message, the smiling Pope also denounced the prophets of doom, whose dark clouds had not dissipated in 6 decades, but who have not been able to eclipse the light of hope that we carry forward. Thank you.